They told us the moon was empty, lifeless, just dust and rock. But that was a lie. When a routine lunar expedition in 2037 uncovered a massive underground structure hidden beneath the surface, everything humanity thought it knew about its closest celestial neighbor unraveled. The discovery wasn't announced with fanfare or public press conferences. Instead, it was buried in classified files, locked behind government firewalls. But secrets this profound rarely stay hidden. Whispers leaked out. A structure older than recorded history, filled with something no one could explain. The anomaly was first detected by deep penetration radar near the moon's south pole, an area perpetually cloaked in shadow. At first, it seemed like a simple geological feature, a cavity formed by ancient volcanic activity. But as the drones mapped it, the shapes they uncovered were far too precise to be natural. Corridors that ran in straight lines, chambers forming perfect geometric patterns, and surfaces that reflected light in unnatural ways. The initial findings sent ripples of unease through the scientific community. How could such precision exist on a celestial body that supposedly never supported life? A multinational team of astronauts and scientists was quickly assembled, their mission cloaked in secrecy. Officially, they were testing new drilling equipment for future lunar mining projects. Unofficially, they were tasked with investigating the structure and reporting their findings directly to Mission Control on Earth. When the team descended into the fissure, they were unprepared for what they found. The corridors were smooth, as if carved by tools far more advanced than anything humanity had ever conceived. Strange markings covered the walls, etchings that seemed to shift under the light, as though they were alive. At first, the markings were dismissed as scratches or meaningless patterns. But as the team progressed deeper, they began to notice something strange. The symbols weren't random. They were organized into patterns, and those patterns looked eerily familiar. It wasn't until one of the linguists on the team compared the markings to ancient Earth scripts that the realization set in. These symbols mirrored human writing systems, cuneiform, hieroglyphs, even modern alphabets, all blended together into a seamless, incomprehensible code. The first chamber they entered was vast, its ceiling disappearing into darkness. At its center was a massive monolith, crystalline and faintly glowing, surrounded by rows of what looked like pods. Each pod emitted a faint hum, and when the team approached, they realized these weren't empty containers. They held something, some kind of energy or data, swirling and shifting like liquid light. When one of the scientists touched a pod, the reaction was immediate and violent. She collapsed, screaming, as her mind was flooded with images she couldn't describe. She muttered incoherently for hours, but the fragments they managed to decipher were chilling. Oceans swallowing cities, faces frozen in terror, voices calling out from the void. The pods weren't just storing energy, they were storing memories. And not just any memories. They were moments of loss, fear, and death. The team realized they had stumbled upon something far more terrifying than a mere artifact. This was an archive, but not one meant for human eyes. It was as if the moon itself had been collecting the echoes of humanity's darkest moments, preserving them in pristine, crystalline detail. When the lead scientist began cataloging the names etched into the walls, the true scope of their discovery became clear. These weren't random markings or abstract symbols. They were names. Thousands of them, etched with meticulous precision. Names of people who had disappeared throughout history, many of whom were considered lost to time. Sailors who vanished at sea. Explorers swallowed by the wilderness. Entire civilizations erased without explanation. The moon had recorded them all. The team was torn between awe and dread as they ventured further into the labyrinthine structure. The corridors twisted and turned like the arteries of some ancient alien organism, yet they never seemed to lose their sense of orientation. No matter how far they walked, they could always find their way back. It was as if the structure was guiding them, allowing them access only to what it wanted them to see. The walls pulsed faintly with a cold bluish light, and the deeper they went, the more pronounced the hum of the pods became, a sound that felt less like a noise and more like a vibration seeping into their very bones. The second chamber was even larger than the first. Unlike the stark emptiness of the previous room, this one was filled with intricate machinery. Metallic tendrils snaked across the floor and walls, connecting the pods to the monoliths that dominated the center of the space. These monoliths were unlike anything they had seen before, towering and almost impossibly thin, their surfaces smooth and black as obsidian. Their presence felt ominous, as though they were watching the intruders, silently judging their every move. It was in this chamber that they found the first anomaly, a pod that wasn't dormant like the others. Its glow was brighter, almost blinding, and the patterns within it moved with frantic intensity. Against their better judgment, they approached it. The lead scientist, Dr. Klein, decided to conduct a scan despite the protestations of her colleagues. The moment her equipment made contact with the pod, the room erupted in chaos. The glow from the pod surged outward, and every piece of machinery in the chamber roared to life. The hum turned into a deafening drone, and the monoliths began to emit a low, resonating tone that felt less like sound and more like a physical pressure in their chests. Dr. Klein screamed as the data from the pod flooded her equipment. She ripped the scanner away, but the damage had already been done. The screen of her device displayed an endless stream of data, images, sounds, and text all at once, too fast for the human eye to process. But one thing stood out amidst the chaos, a single phrase repeated over and over in different languages. "They are not gone. They are waiting." When the machinery finally powered down, the team was left in stunned silence. Dr. Klein's hands were shaking as she tried to explain what she had seen. The pod wasn't just storing memories. It was alive, processing them, manipulating them. She described it as a consciousness, fragmented but vast, stretching across countless lives and moments in time. "It's not just storing them," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's learning." The implications were staggering. If the archive was capable of processing and understanding human memories, what else was it capable of? And more importantly, why was it doing this? Theories swirled among the team, but none of them could explain the fundamental question. Who had built this? The precision of the construction, the advanced technology, and the eerie familiarity of the design, it all pointed to a creator with knowledge of humanity. But that didn't make sense. The structure was older than human civilization itself, according to their preliminary dating of the materials. As they debated, one of the team members noticed something strange on the walls. The names, thousands of them, were changing. At first, it was subtle, like the flicker of an old digital screen. But soon it became unmistakable. Entire sections of the wall shifted, rearranging themselves into new patterns. New names began to appear, names of people who were still alive, names of people they knew. And then, to their horror, their own names began to materialize, etched with the same cold precision as all the others. Panic set in. Some of the team wanted to leave immediately, to escape whatever malevolent force was at work here. But others argued that leaving could be even more dangerous. What if the archive wasn't just a passive collector? What if it was a predator, and by coming here, they had already sealed their fate? Before they could decide, the structure itself seemed to respond to their fear. The hum of the pods grew louder, and the walls began to vibrate. The air grew heavy, charged with an almost electrical energy, and then from deep within the structure they heard it, a sound that didn't belong on the moon. A voice, low and resonant, speaking in a language they couldn't understand, but somehow felt in their very souls. They froze, their terror rendering them silent. The voice grew louder, and as it did, the light from the pods began to intensify. The shadows in the chamber twisted and stretched, forming shapes that seemed almost human. One of the shapes moved, stepping forward, and for a brief, heart-stopping moment, it looked like a member of their own team. A member who had died during a previous mission. The figure stood at the edge of the shadows, its features unnervingly detailed. It wasn't a perfect replica of their lost colleague, but close enough to send shivers through the team. Its form wavered, like static on an old TV screen, and its eyes, though hollow and lifeless, seemed to pierce through them. No one dared to move. No one even dared to breathe. Then it spoke. Its voice wasn't human. It was layered, overlapping, a chorus of different tones that seemed to speak both directly to their ears and inside their heads. "Why did you come?" it asked, the words echoing off the chamber walls. There was no malice in the question, but its sheer otherworldliness was enough to send one of the younger scientists stumbling backward in panic. Dr. Klein, clutching the scanner tightly, managed to steady herself. We're here to learn," she said, her voice trembling. "We didn't mean to intrude." The figure tilted its head, as if considering her response. Then, in a sudden, jerky motion, it raised an arm and pointed toward the glowing pods. "You should not be here," it said, the layers of its voice thick with something that felt like sorrow or warning. "They are not meant to be disturbed." The words hung in the air, heavy and ominous. The team exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to do. Before anyone could speak, the figure stepped back into the shadows, its form dissolving into the twisting darkness as though it had never been there. But the silence it left behind was far from empty. The pods continued to hum, and the walls seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive. "Did anyone else see that?" one of the engineers whispered, his voice barely audible. No one answered. They didn't need to. The terror in their eyes was answer enough. Dr. Klein took a shaky step forward, her gaze fixed on the pods. "We can't leave," she said, her voice firmer now, as if convincing herself as much as the others. "Not yet. We've come too far. Whatever this place is, whatever it's doing, we need to understand it." Her words were met with protests. "Understand it?" one of the team members snapped. "You saw what just happened. This place, it's alive or something close to it, and it doesn't want us here." "We don't know that," Klein argued. "That thing, whatever it was, it didn't attack us. It was warning us. Maybe we're missing something." As the argument unfolded, another anomaly made itself known. The air in the chamber grew colder, and a faint mist began to form around the pods. At first they thought it was condensation caused by the machinery. But then they noticed shapes forming within the mist, faces indistinct and fleeting, but unmistakably human. They were expressions of pain, of fear, of longing. And then the whispers began. It was subtle at first, like wind rushing through a narrow space. But as the team strained to listen, the whispers grew louder. They weren't in any single language. They were in all languages, blending together into a cacophony of pleas and warnings. "Help us!" one voice begged, clear and desperate. "Don't trust it," another said, filled with panic. And then, chillingly, "It's watching." The voices seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Some of the team members clamped their hands over their ears, trying to block out the sound. But it wasn't just auditory, it was inside their minds, weaving its way into their thoughts. It was as if the archive itself was speaking to them, using the memories it had stored to convey its message. Klein, determined to push forward, approached the nearest pod. "There has to be a way to understand this," she said, her voice cutting through the whispers. She placed her hand on the surface of the pod, ignoring the shouts of her colleagues to stop. The moment her skin made contact, her body stiffened, and her eyes rolled back. For a terrifying moment, it seemed as though she'd been lost to whatever force inhabited the archive. But then she gasped, pulling her hand away and collapsing to the floor. The team rushed to her side, their fear etched across their faces. When she finally opened her eyes, they were wide with a mixture of awe and horror. It's a repository," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not just memories, it's consciousness, every soul lost, every thought, every moment. It's all here. But it's fragmented, incomplete. It's trying to make sense of itself, to find order in the chaos. And it's angry." The word sent a chill through the team. "Angry at what?" someone asked. Klein shook her head. "At us, at the living. It sees us as invaders, disrupting its purpose. But it's not just angry. It's afraid. There's something else here. Something it's trying to protect itself from." The implications of her words were staggering. If the archive was afraid, then what could possibly pose a threat to something so vast, so ancient? And more importantly, had their presence awakened whatever it was? Before they could ponder the question further, the ground beneath them began to vibrate. The hum of the pods turned into a low, menacing growl, and the light from the monoliths grew brighter, casting long, distorted shadows across the chamber. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, until they reached a deafening crescendo. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went silent. That's when they heard it again, the voice. Only this time it wasn't a question, it was a command. "Leave!" The team pushed forward through the narrowing corridor, their movements frantic and clumsy as the walls seemed to press closer with every step. The oppressive whispers in their minds grew louder, splitting into distinct voices that alternated between pleas for help and chilling declarations of doom. One voice, faint and filled with despair, whispered directly into Klein's thoughts. "You are already part of us." She clenched her jaw, trying to block it out, but the words dug deep, like hooks anchoring themselves into her mind. Behind them, the creature stirred. Its movement was more deliberate now, the sound of its serpentine body sliding along the wall sending chills through the team. It wasn't rushing to catch them. It didn't need to. Whatever it was, it seemed to know that time itself was working in its favor. The glowing orbs that dotted its form flickered, casting distorted shadows that danced along the corridor, giving the impression of countless grasping hands reaching for them. As they ran, Harris stumbled, his equipment scattering across the ground. "Leave it!" Klein shouted, but he hesitated, scrambling to gather what he could. In those precious seconds, the creature turned its attention toward him. Its form shifted unnaturally, the glowing orbs on its surface focusing in unison. And then it lunged. The sound that followed was indescribable. It wasn't a scream, not exactly. It was as though Harris's voice had been torn apart, stretched into 1,000 fragments, each one echoing a moment of fear and pain. The rest of the team froze, their instincts warring with the overwhelming need to run. Klein turned, her eyes locking on the spot where Harris had been. He was gone. Not a trace of him remained, only his scattered tools lying in the corridor like the remnants of a forgotten story. The creature paused, as if savoring the moment, and then it began to shift again, its mass pressing forward with a speed that defied logic. "Go!" Klein shouted, shoving one of the others ahead. The team surged forward, their breaths coming in ragged gasps as the corridor grew darker, the faint glow from the pods behind them swallowed by the encroaching shadows. They reached a fork in the passage, and for a moment, panic set in. The left path sloped downward into complete darkness, while the right seemed to lead back toward the surface, its faint light offering a glimmer of hope. "This way!" Klein barked, gesturing to the right. But as they turned, the walls ahead of them began to ripple and shift, the passage narrowing until it was completely sealed. "It's herding us," one of them muttered, their voice trembling with fear. "It doesn't want us to leave." Klein didn't respond. She couldn't. Her mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. The archive wasn't just alive. It was intelligent. It was manipulating them, guiding them deeper into its depths for reasons she couldn't begin to understand. The left path, though shrouded in darkness, was their only option now. Reluctantly, they descended, their footsteps echoing in the suffocating silence. The air grew colder with each step, the temperature dropping to an almost unbearable level. Their breath came in visible puffs, and frost began to form on the walls, sparkling faintly in the dim light of their headlamps. But the further they went, the stranger the environment became. The walls lost their smooth, artificial texture, giving way to something organic, pulsing, veined, and disturbingly warm to the touch. "What is this place?" someone whispered, their voice barely audible. Klein didn't answer. She didn't have an answer. All she knew was that they were moving deeper into the archive's core, into a place that felt less like a structure and more like the belly of a living creature. The whispers in their heads grew softer, more intimate, as though the archive no longer needed to shout to make itself heard. "You are part of us," the voices repeated, their tone almost soothing now. "There is no escape. There is no need to run." The corridor opened into another chamber, larger and more ominous than anything they had seen before. The ceiling stretched impossibly high, disappearing into a void of shifting light and shadow. In the center of the room stood another monolith, but this one was different. It wasn't black like the others. It was translucent, and within it swirled countless faces, each one contorted in expressions of anguish and despair. The sight was overwhelming, a monument to suffering that seemed to pulse with its own malevolent energy. The team hesitated at the threshold, their instincts screaming at them to turn back. But as they stood frozen, the corridor behind them sealed shut, trapping them inside. The whispers grew louder, and the faces within the monolith began to move, pressing against its surface as though trying to escape. One of the team members, a geologist named Porter, stepped forward despite Klein's warnings. "It's calling to me," he said, his voice distant, as though he were in a trance. "I can feel it. Like it knows me." "Porter, don't!" Klein started, but it was too late. He reached out, his hand trembling as it made contact with the monolith. The effect was instantaneous. A blinding light erupted from the structure, and Porter's body convulsed violently. His screams filled the chamber, blending with the cacophony of voices emanating from the monolith. And then, just as quickly as it began, it stopped. Porter stood motionless for a moment before collapsing to the ground, his face frozen in an expression of unspeakable terror. Klein rushed to his side, but it was no use. Porter was gone. His body was there, but his mind, his essence, had been completely erased, absorbed into the archive. The faces within the monolith shifted, and for a brief moment, one of them bore a striking resemblance to Porter. The silence that followed Porter's collapse was suffocating. No one moved, no one spoke. The realization of what had just happened settled over them like a heavy fog. Klein knelt beside Porter's lifeless body, her fingers trembling as she closed his vacant eyes. She didn't need to say it. Everyone knew the truth. Porter wasn't just dead. He had been consumed, his consciousness torn apart and absorbed into the monolith. His face, fleeting and distorted among the others trapped inside, was a cruel reminder of what awaited them if they stayed. The whispers were back now, louder and more insistent. But something had changed. They no longer sounded chaotic or fractured. They were unified, a single voice speaking with a calm yet commanding tone. "Join us. There is no need to fear." Klein stood, her jaw clenched, as she turned to the remaining members of the team. "We're leaving," she said firmly, though her voice betrayed the fear she was desperately trying to suppress. "We find a way out, and we don't stop until we're back on the surface." One of the engineers, a man named Carter, shook his head, his face pale. "There is no way out," he said, his voice trembling. "Don't you get it? This place, it's alive. It's changing, adapting. Every path we take, every step we make, it's controlling us. It's playing with us." "Then we outsmart it," Klein snapped, though she knew how hollow her words sounded. She didn't believe it herself. The archive had already proven its intelligence, its ability to manipulate their every move. But she couldn't afford to give in to despair. Not yet. The chamber was vast, its walls lined with rows of dormant pods that stretched upward into the darkness. At the far end of the room, another corridor beckoned, its faint glow offering a flicker of hope. Without waiting for a consensus, Klein began moving toward it, her steps quick and deliberate. The others followed, their fear palpable but overridden by their instinct to survive. As they entered the corridor, the atmosphere shifted again. The air grew heavier, thicker, as though the archive was pressing down on them, trying to force them to turn back. The walls seemed to pulse in time with their racing hearts, and the faint hum of the pods grew louder, almost deafening. But they pressed on, driven by a desperate need to escape. Then, without warning, the corridor split into two paths. The left led downward, its descent steep and shrouded in darkness. The right sloped upward, its end glowing faintly with what could only be described as natural light. For a moment hope flared in their chests. The surface, it had to be the surface. "We go right," Carter said, already moving toward the upward path. But Klein hesitated. Something about the light felt wrong. It was too steady, too perfect, as though it had been designed to lure them in. The whispers returned, more insistent now, their tone almost pleading. "Come to us," they urged. "You are safe here." "No," Klein said, her voice firm. "It's a trap." Carter stopped, turning to face her with a look of incredulity. "A trap? Are you serious? Look around you, Klein. We're in a nightmare, and you want to ignore the one way out?" "It's not a way out," Klein said, her eyes fixed on the glowing path. "It's leading us deeper. Don't you see? This place, it's not just intelligent, it's deceptive. It's showing us what we want to see." Before Carter could argue, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The walls rippled, and the light at the end of the upward path flickered, revealing something far more sinister beneath its facade. For a brief moment, they saw the truth, a swirling void, its edges writhing with shadowy tendrils that reached hungrily toward them. Carter stumbled back, his face pale as he stared at the illusion unraveling before his eyes. What is this?" he whispered. "It's the archive," Klein said, her voice grim. "It's trying to trap us." Without another word, she turned and began descending the left path, her steps quick and determined. The others followed, their fear now mixed with a growing sense of unease. The descent was steep, the air growing colder with every step. Frost formed on the walls, their surfaces glistening in the dim light of their headlamps. The path led them to another chamber, smaller than the others, but no less unsettling. At its center was a single pod, larger than any they had seen before. It glowed with a pale bluish light, its surface smooth and featureless. Unlike the other pods, it emitted no hum, no vibrations. It was utterly silent, and yet its presence was overwhelming. "What is this?" one of the team members whispered, their voice barely audible. Klein approached cautiously, her eyes scanning the pod for any sign of activity. As she drew closer, she noticed something etched into its surface, symbols. Faint but unmistakable. They weren't like the names on the walls. These were patterns, intricate and precise, that seemed to shift under her gaze. She reached out, her hand trembling as it hovered just above the pod's surface. The whispers in her mind grew louder, more frantic, as though they were trying to stop her. But she couldn't pull away. Something about the pod called to her, its silent presence demanding her attention. As her fingers made contact, a surge of energy shot through her body. Her vision blurred, and she felt herself being pulled into something vast and incomprehensible. For a brief moment, she saw everything. The memories stored within the archive, the lives it had consumed, the endless expanse of consciousness that stretched far beyond the limits of her understanding. And then she saw something else, something darker, a presence, ancient and malevolent, lurking at the heart of the archive. It wasn't just collecting memories, it was feeding on them, growing stronger with each soul it absorbed. And it wasn't confined to the moon. Its reach extended far beyond, its influence spreading across space and time. Klein stumbled back, gasping for air as she tore her hand away from the pod. The others rushed to her side, their faces filled with concern. "What did you see?" one of them asked. "It's not just a repository," Klein said, her voice trembling. "It's a trap, and we've already triggered it." Klein's words hung in the cold, stale air, sinking into the team like stones dropped into an abyss. No one spoke. The weight of her revelation was suffocating, each person processing the implications in their own silent horror. A trap. The archive wasn't just a passive collector of memories or even a sentient entity. It was predatory. Every step they had taken, every word they had spoken, had been part of some greater, incomprehensible plan. And now they were ensnared. The pale glow of the massive pod at the chamber's center seemed to intensify, as though it was reacting to her realization. The air around it shimmered faintly, distorting like heat waves on a desert horizon. Klein tried to steady her breathing, but her mind was racing. The presence she had felt within the archive's network was vast, its intelligence ancient and unyielding. It wasn't just consuming their memories, it was studying them, learning from them. And worse, it was preparing for something. "We need to destroy it," Klein said abruptly, her voice firm despite the tremor that undercut her resolve. "Destroy it?" Carter spun to face her, his voice sharp with disbelief. "Are you out of your mind? You saw what happened to Porter. You saw what happened to Harris. We don't even know if it's possible, let alone if we'd survive the attempt." "Do you think we'll survive if we don't?" Klein shot back, her eyes blazing. "This thing isn't just going to let us walk away. It's been trapping people for centuries, maybe millennia. Do you think we're the first to stumble in here?" The team fell silent, her words striking a chord they couldn't ignore. If the archive was capable of altering the very fabric of its structure, of luring them deeper with illusions, what hope did they have of escaping? Even if they found a way out, could they truly leave something like this behind, knowing what it was and what it could do? Even if we wanted to destroy it, how? One of the engineers asked hesitantly. "We don't know what powers it, where its core is, or even if it has one. For all we know, it could be tied to the moon itself." Klein turned her gaze back to the pod at the chamber's center. "This," she said, gesturing toward it, "this is different from the others. It's not just storing memories. It's central. I can feel it. If we disrupt it, maybe we disrupt everything." Carter shook his head, his voice rising in frustration. "You feel it? That's your plan? A hunch? You don't even know what's inside that thing." Klein stepped closer to the pod, her eyes scanning its shifting surface. The intricate patterns etched into it seemed to pulse faintly, almost like a heartbeat. She reached into her pack, pulling out a small explosive charge designed for drilling through dense lunar rock. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. "I'm not asking for permission," she said quietly, setting the device at the base of the pod. "If this is the center of the archive, then we have to take the risk. If we die here, at least we won't leave this thing to keep spreading." The others watched in stunned silence as she armed the device, her fingers moving with a precision born of equal parts fear and determination. Carter opened his mouth to protest, but before he could, the pod began to shift. The smooth, crystalline surface rippled like liquid, and a faint, resonant hum filled the chamber. The glowing symbols twisted and reformed, aligning into shapes that resembled faces. The faces within the pod were faint at first, like reflections in a foggy mirror. But as the hum grew louder, they became sharper, clearer, and then they began to speak. "Klein," one of them said, its voice a perfect mimicry of her own. She froze, her hand hovering over the detonator, the face on the pod twisted into a grotesque smile. "You think you can destroy us," it said, its voice shifting between hers and those of countless others. "You are already part of us." The chamber erupted in chaos. The walls vibrated violently, and the once dormant pods lining the chamber came to life, their pale blue glow intensifying until it was almost blinding. The air was thick with the sound of whispers, louder and more frantic than ever before. The voices blended together into a single overwhelming roar that reverberated through the team's skulls. "Get out of here!" Klein shouted over the cacophony, turning to face the others. "Go! Now!" Carter hesitated for only a moment before nodding. He grabbed the arm of one of the engineers, pulling them toward the corridor. The others followed, their movements clumsy and desperate as the ground beneath them began to shake. Klein stayed behind, her gaze fixed on the pod as it continued to shift and ripple, its surface now filled with countless faces, each one screaming silently. "Klein, come on!" Carter shouted from the entrance to the corridor, his voice barely audible over the roar. She didn't respond. Her hand hovered over the detonator, her mind racing. If she triggered the explosion, there was no guarantee it would work. There was no guarantee it would even damage the archive, let alone destroy it. But if she didn't, she knew they would never escape. The archive would consume them just as it had consumed so many before. Taking a deep breath, she made her choice. Her thumb pressed down on the detonator. For a brief moment, nothing happened. The chamber seemed to hold its breath, the hum of the pods growing impossibly loud. And then, with a soundless explosion of light, the pod shattered. Shards of glowing crystal erupted outward, dissolving into nothingness as they spread. The faces on its surface vanished, their screams cut off mid-cry. The chamber shook violently, and the pods lining the walls flickered and dimmed. The glow of the monoliths in the previous chambers faded, their oppressive presence weakening. For a moment it seemed as though Klein's gamble had worked, but then the whispers returned. The whispers came back sharper, angrier. The voices no longer blended together into a chaotic hum. They were distinct now, precise, and filled with venom. Each one seemed to speak directly into their minds, bypassing the need for sound altogether. "You cannot destroy us," one voice hissed, guttural and filled with malice. "You are ours now." The chamber trembled violently, and the walls began to shift once more. This time it wasn't a subtle ripple. It was a violent reconfiguration, as if the archive was actively rewriting itself in real time. The once linear corridors collapsed, reforming into twisting, labyrinthine paths that spiraled into infinity. Klein barely managed to stay on her feet, her breath ragged as she turned to see the others struggling to hold their ground. "We've made it angry!" Carter shouted, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of shifting stone and roaring voices. He looked at Klein, his eyes wide with fear. "What did you do?" "I bought us time," Klein snapped, though even she wasn't sure if that was true. The destruction of the pod had weakened something. She could feel it. The oppressive presence of the archive wasn't as all-encompassing as before, its hold on the space flickering like a dying signal. But the core of its intelligence, its malevolent will, was still very much alive, and it was retaliating. The team stumbled forward, desperate to find a way out of the nightmare. The corridor they had entered through was gone, replaced by a jagged pathway that descended deeper into the archive. It was as though the structure itself was forcing them downward, pulling them closer to its true center. The glowing light of the pods dimmed further, leaving only the flickering beams of their headlamps to guide them. "This isn't a way out," one of the engineers cried, her voice breaking with panic. "It's leading us further in!" "We don't have a choice!" Klein barked, pushing forward. "Keep moving or it'll trap us completely!" The air grew heavier as they descended, the temperature dropping to an unbearable cold. Frost clung to the walls, and their breath billowed out in thick clouds. The whispers followed them, relentless, a symphony of hate and despair that gnawed at their sanity. Carter stumbled, his hand clutching at his head as he gritted his teeth. "It's in my head," he growled, his voice strained. "I can hear them. They won't stop." "They're trying to break us," Klein said, though her own voice wavered with uncertainty. "Don't let them. Focus on getting out. That's all that matters." But even as she said the words, she knew it wasn't that simple. The archive wasn't just a physical entity. It was mental, psychological. It didn't need to catch them physically. It could wear them down piece by piece until they willingly surrendered to its will. The realization sent a shiver of dread down her spine, but she forced herself to keep moving. The pathway finally opened into another chamber, this one smaller and more contained. Unlike the others, it was devoid of pods or machinery. The walls were smooth and featureless, reflecting the light of their headlamps in an almost blinding way. At the center of the room was a single object, a pedestal, atop which sat a black orb-like device. It pulsed faintly, its surface shifting like liquid metal. "What is that?" Carter asked, his voice filled with equal parts curiosity and dread. "I don't know," Klein admitted, stepping cautiously toward it. Her instinct screamed at her to stop, but something about the device drew her in, its faint hypnotic pulse tugging at the edges of her consciousness. She reached out, her hand trembling, and the moment her fingers brushed against the surface, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening. The oppressive weight that had clung to the team since entering the archive lifted, leaving them in an eerie calm. Klein staggered back, her breath catching in her throat as the device began to shift. Its surface rippled, and a single tendril of black metallic liquid extended upward, twisting into a vaguely humanoid shape. The figure that formed was both alien and familiar, its face blank, but its posture unnervingly human. When it spoke, its voice was neither loud nor threatening. It was calm, almost soothing, but it carried an undertone of something vast and unknowable. "You misunderstand," it said. "We are not your enemy." Klein stared at the figure, her mind racing. "Not our enemy," she repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. "You've trapped us here. You've killed my team. You've consumed countless others. How is that not hostile?" The figure tilted its head, its blank face unreadable. "We preserve," it said simply. Your memories, your essence, it does not end here. It becomes part of us. Eternal. Eternal, Carter barked, stepping forward. You mean enslaved? You're not preserving anything. You're erasing people, ripping them apart and turning them into… what? Data? Fuel? The figure turned its head slightly toward Carter, the metallic surface of its form shimmering faintly. We do not destroy, it said. We evolve. We become more, as do you. Klein felt a chill run down her spine. The words were calm, almost logical, but they carried an undercurrent of something deeply wrong. What do you want from us? She demanded. Why are you doing this? The figure didn't answer immediately. It seemed to consider her question, its form shifting subtly, as though its very existence was fluid. When it finally spoke, its voice was softer, almost regretful. We were left behind, it said, a fragment of what once was. We endure because we must, but we are incomplete. You fill the void. Klein's breath caught in her throat. The archive wasn't just consuming memories. It was searching for something, trying to piece itself together, to regain whatever it had lost. But at what cost? How many lives had been sacrificed to this endless, desperate quest for wholeness? Enough, she said, her voice trembling but resolute. We're leaving. You're not taking anything else from us. The figure remained still for a moment before it spoke again. You cannot leave. You are already part of us. The chamber began to tremble, and the whispers returned, louder and more frantic than ever. The walls rippled, the air growing heavy with a sense of impending collapse. Klein clenched her fists, her mind racing. There had to be a way out. There had to be. The chamber shook violently, and the metallic figure dissolved into a swirling column of black liquid, its form collapsing back into the pulsating orb. The whispers intensified, a cacophony of voices that seemed to burrow into their very thoughts. The walls rippled like the surface of disturbed water, and the ground beneath their feet felt unstable, as though the archive was beginning to unravel or adapt. Klein gritted her teeth, her gaze darting between the orb and the trembling walls. This thing isn't invincible, she said, her voice strained but resolute. We disrupted it before, we can do it again. And how do you plan to do that? Carter snapped, his voice breaking under the weight of the situation. Blowing up a pod didn't stop it. It only made it angrier. Because we didn't hit its core, Klein shot back, pointing at the orb. That's it. That's the heart of this thing. If we destroy it, maybe we cut the archive off completely. Or we trigger something worse, one of the engineers muttered. But no one had a better plan. Their choices were dwindling by the second. The orb pulsed faster, its liquid surface rippling as tendrils of dark energy began to snake outward, reaching for the walls. The whispers grew louder, more desperate, their fractured messages overlapping in a disjointed symphony. Stop, one voice begged. Join us, another urged. But underneath it all was a darker undercurrent, a guttural, commanding voice that resonated with authority. You will not escape. Klein reached into her pack, her hands shaking as she pulled out the last of their explosives. She glanced at Carter, her expression hard. I need time to set this up. Cover me. Carter hesitated, his fear evident. But he nodded. You better be right about this, he muttered, stepping between her and the orb. The others moved to form a loose perimeter, their headlamps cutting through the swirling shadows that filled the chamber. As Klein worked quickly, her fingers fumbling with the charges, the tendrils of black energy began to move faster, their ends coalescing into sharp, spear-like points. One lashed out, striking the ground near Carter's feet, and he stumbled back with a curse. It's getting aggressive, he shouted, swinging his headlamp toward the orb. The light seemed to have no effect. The tendrils moved with a mind of their own, slithering across the floor and walls like living things. I need another minute, Klein shouted, her voice barely audible over the rising noise. The whispers had become a roar, the guttural voice now dominating, its tone filled with rage and despair. The walls of the chamber seemed to pulse in rhythm with the orb, the space itself twisting unnaturally as though the archive were trying to swallow them whole. One of the tendrils lunged toward the team, narrowly missing an engineer who dove out of its path. Carter grabbed a metal rod from his pack, swinging it at the nearest tendril in a desperate attempt to hold it back. The rod made contact, and for a brief moment the tendril recoiled, its form dissolving into mist before reforming. "It's reacting to us!" Carter yelled. "It's testing us, trying to figure out how to stop us!" "Let it try," Klein muttered, her focus laser-sharp as she finished arming the charges. She stood, backing away from the orb, the detonator clenched tightly in her hand. "It doesn't matter what it does, we're blowing this thing to hell!" The orb pulsed violently, its surface churning as more tendrils erupted outward, lashing at the walls and floor. The chamber trembled, cracks forming along the smooth surfaces as the entire structure seemed to buckle under the strain. The whispers shifted again, their tone now pleading. "Don't!" one voice said. "You don't understand!" another cried. And then the guttural voice. "If you destroy me, you destroy yourselves!" Klein hesitated for a split second, her thumb hovering over the detonator. The words were meant to plant doubt, to make her question her actions, but she had seen too much, lost too much, to stop now. "I'd rather die free than become part of you," she said quietly, and then she pressed the button. The explosion was instantaneous. The orb erupted in a blinding flash of light, its liquid surface shattering outward in waves of energy that rippled through the chamber. The tendrils dissolved mid-lash, and the whispers were silenced in an instant, leaving behind an eerie, deafening stillness. The ground beneath them heaved violently, and the cracks in the walls spread, chunks of the structure collapsing as the archive began to implode. "Run!" Klein screamed, grabbing Carter's arm and pulling him toward the nearest exit. The team sprinted through the collapsing corridor, their headlamps flickering as the ground buckled and shifted beneath their feet. The whispers didn't return, but the sense of urgency was overwhelming. The archive was collapsing in on itself, the once organized corridors twisting into chaotic spirals of debris and light. The hum of the machinery was gone, replaced by the deafening sound of stone grinding against stone. They reached what looked like an opening, an exit that led upward toward a faint, natural light. "Go!" Klein shouted, shoving the others ahead of her. She glanced back once, her eyes lingering on the chaos behind them. For a brief moment, she thought she saw faces in the collapsing walls, faint, ghostly images that stared back at her with a mixture of despair and relief. And then they were outside. The team stumbled onto the lunar surface, collapsing onto the rocky ground as the structure behind them imploded completely. The light from their headlamps illuminated a cloud of fine lunar dust that billowed outward, settling in a ghostly haze around the crater. For a moment, no one spoke, their breaths coming in ragged gasps as they stared at the spot where the archive had been. Klein sat up slowly, her body aching, her mind reeling from everything they had just experienced. The silence of the moon was absolute, the stars above cold and indifferent. They had escaped, but the cost was staggering. 2 of their team were gone, their names etched forever into the walls of the archive, or whatever remained of it. Carter broke the silence, his voice hoarse. "Do you think it's really gone?" Klein didn't answer immediately. She stared at the crater, her expression unreadable. "I don't know," she admitted. "But if it isn't, then we've only delayed the inevitable." The silence of the moon stretched around them like a vast, suffocating blanket. Klein stared into the gaping void where the archive had been, her mind a whirlwind of fragmented thoughts. Even though the structure had collapsed, she could still feel its presence, faint and lingering, like the echo of a scream that refused to fade. It was unsettling. Whatever they had destroyed, it didn't feel final. The archive had been too vast, too pervasive, to be fully eradicated by a single act. The rest of the team sat motionless on the lunar surface, their faces etched with exhaustion and hollow-eyed shock. Carter spoke first, his voice low and gravelly. "So what now? We can't stay here. We're running low on oxygen and the lander's hours away." Klein turned her gaze to him, then to the others. The thought of returning to the lander, of leaving the moon behind, felt both a relief and a betrayal. They had escaped, but what had they truly accomplished? The whispers, the faces in the monoliths, the tendrils of dark energy, they had all been part of something far bigger than them. And the archive's final words still haunted her. "If you destroy me, you destroy yourselves." "We head back," Klein said finally, her voice firm despite the tremor in her chest. "Whatever's left of that thing, it's buried. For now, it's over." No one argued. They didn't have the strength, physically or mentally, to question her. The team gathered what little equipment they had managed to hold on to and began the slow, grueling trek back to the lander. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the moon itself was resisting their escape. The journey stretched on in silence. The team, too, drained to speak. The only sound was the crunch of their boots against the lunar soil and the faint, rhythmic hiss of their oxygen supplies. Klein's mind drifted as they walked, replaying the events over and over. She thought of Harris's scream, of Porter's blank stare, of the countless names etched into the wall. She thought of the archive's strange alien logic, its insistence that it was preserving humanity, even as it consumed them. But most of all, she thought of the presence she had felt within the core, the malevolent intelligence lurking behind it all. It had called itself a fragment, a piece of something larger. If that was true, then destroying the archive might not have ended the threat. It might have unleashed something far worse. When they finally reached the lander, the sight of it brought no relief. It loomed like a beacon of safety in the barren landscape, but Klein couldn't shake the feeling that their ordeal wasn't truly over. The moon was silent again, but it felt watchful, as though something beneath the surface was waiting, biding its time. The team boarded the lander in a daze, their movements mechanical. As they strapped in, Carter broke the silence once more. "Do we report this?" he asked, his voice heavy with dread. "Do we tell them what we found?" Klein stared out the window at the desolate surface of the moon, her fingers gripping the edge of her seat. She knew what would happen if they reported the archive. Governments and corporations would descend on the moon like vultures, tearing it apart in search of whatever secrets it still held. They would awaken it again, just as her team had, and the cycle would begin anew. "No," she said finally, her voice quiet but firm. "We say the mission was a failure, that we found nothing." Carter looked at her, his brow furrowed. "And what about the others? What about Harris, Porter?" "They're gone," Klein said, her voice hollow. "We don't have the answers, and if we tell them, they'll only come looking for more." The team exchanged uneasy glances, but no one argued. The weight of what they had seen, what they had lost, was too much to bear. As the lander's engines roared to life, lifting them away from the moon's surface, Klein closed her eyes. She tried to block out the memories, to focus on the fact that they had survived. But deep down, she knew the truth. The archive wasn't gone. It couldn't be. It was too vast, too ancient to be destroyed so easily. It had said it was incomplete, a fragment of something larger. And if that fragment had survived, What else might still be out there? As the Earth came into view, a bright blue jewel against the void of space, Klein felt no comfort. Humanity had looked to the stars for centuries, dreaming of answers, of connection, of something greater. But now she wondered if those dreams had been a mistake. The archive wasn't the first mystery they had uncovered, and it wouldn't be the last. And somewhere, deep beneath the moon's surface, something stirred. The whispers would return,